Consider this before viewing great books, The Jungle. What is the American dream? Think about the expectations immigrants had for their new lives in America at the turn of the 20th century. As you watch the program, pay attention to the realities the immigrants faced once they settled in America. Assignment Discovery now presents great books, The Jungle.
For an immigrant family, the American dream becomes a nightmare. Death haunts the factories, the jails, the homes. Author Upton Sinclair risked his life to tell the awful truth about Chicago's meatpackers. The time is the turn of the century, the 20th century. The place, Chicago. An engagement party fills the air with the sounds of hope. To be wed is Ona Lukashaita, a Lithuanian beauty. She and her relatives have gambled on a new life in the new world. Her betrothed is Yorgos Rudkus, a laborer from the old country. Ona agreed to marry Yorgos if he would lead their move to America. The couple's relatives are at the heart of the celebration. Marija, Ona's cousin, a widow and a savvy survivor. And Antonis, Yorgos' father, determined to pull his weight in the meat plants. All are new arrivals, hoping to take part in the American dream. But as some desperate, disillusioned guests at the party know, these newcomers are dreaming. And tragically, they are about to awaken. The party begins Upton Sinclair's groundbreaking novel, The Jungle. With The Jungle, Sinclair targeted meatpacking corporations for their savage treatment of workers. But Americans were outraged by its descriptions of factories that poisoned their food with deadly diseases. I aimed for the public's heart, Sinclair confessed, but by accident, hit it in the stomach.
When his book hit, it really hit. And it's one of those examples where ideas do make history.
At the time that The Jungle was written, the plants were horrible places to work. They were full of violence. They weren't clean. And frequently, diseased and dead animals were slaughtered and made into food.
It was a wake-up call for the country. It was also the right book at the right time in American history. Up to that point in time, the public hadn't really thought too much about the conditions of the meat that they were buying.
Sinclair meant for The Jungle to sound the alarm about a crisis in the workplace that began in the 19th century. America's economy had shifted from agriculture to manufacturing. The number of factory workers increased tenfold. Enticed by these jobs, nearly 9 million immigrants entered the United States. But the cost of food and household goods was soaring, and wages fell. Desperate for work, the immigrants took jobs no one else wanted.
Imagine the kind of picture they had of America. And after seeing that beautiful Statue of Liberty, then they end up in slaughtering houses in these dark, dank places with the butcher knives slashing dead meat.
Think about an individual coming from a rural agricultural kind of society, whether you think about Yorgos coming from Lithuania or a black migrant coming from the deep south, Mississippi, coming into a large industrial city, working in a mass production industry like meatpacking. Sinclair was writing on the crust of a giant wave of social and economic change that took place in the course of the late 19th century.
In these chutes, the stream of animals was continuous. It was quite uncanny to watch them pressing on to their fate, all unsuspicious, a very river of death.
Due to his size, Jorgis Rutkus, the jungle's hero, easily meets Packingtown's first challenge. He finds a job. The hours are long, the pay miserable, and the pace killing. When a worker grows ill or is injured, he's cast aside, and hundreds of jobless men fight to replace him.
It was live or die, sink or swim. So the deadened conditions in the slaughtering house and that death that permeated also permeated the battle between the owners and the workers. But in this case, the masters and the slaves, because the conditions there were really slave-like conditions.
Jorgis endures the hardships without complaint. Soon he's put a down payment on a modest house for Ona, Antonis, and Marija. In their new home, the immigrants share tales of Packingtown's horrors.
Animals with broken backs and broken legs, cut with horrible diseases I've never seen before. By the time the government inspector comes back from his tea, we are done with our dirty work.
Literally, it was caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. It was wide open. There was absolutely no safety controls in place whatsoever. You could virtually do whatever you wanted in that factory. It was out of sight, out of mind.
Jorgis' father, Antonis, cleans the floors of a butchering plant. He explains how filth from the floor is sold as canned meat.
There's a cage below the floor that catches all but the smallest bits. Where do the bad parts go? I put them in a barrel for canned meat.
Upton Sinclair went into the plants and he saw dead animals being slaughtered. He saw filth all over the plant. He saw products going into sausage that shouldn't have been there. But more importantly, he came out of the plant radicalized by what happened to the workers, how they got chewed up the same way the food did.
Disguised as a worker, Sinclair plunged into a modern hell where human life was indescribably cheap. Men in the pickle rooms had their fingers eaten by acid. Those who worked in the cooking rooms lived in danger of falling into open vats of boiling meat and being cooked alive. In his youth, Sinclair shared something powerful with Packingtown's expendable immigrants. He was desperately poor.
We never had but one room at a time, and I slept on a sofa or crossways at the foot of my parents' bed.
He was born in Baltimore in 1879 to a once prosperous Southern family. His father was an alcoholic who sold whiskey and straw hats. Sinclair grew up in cheap boarding houses and spent boyhood hours combing bars, even gutters, to lead his drunken father home.
Hardship, poverty, cold, and bed bugs. And bed bugs. He mentions this all the time in his autobiographical writings. He saw writing as a way out of his conditions.
Sinclair would blaze a trail for consumer advocates everywhere. 99% of Americans are meat eaters, consuming on average about twice their weight in meat each year.
We forget that in the 19th century, meat became a production industry and became industrialized, taken out of the home and taken into the factories.
Canned meat was an experiment in convenience and catastrophe. Around 1900, during the Spanish-American War, some 1,000 Americans died from tainted meat, about 3 times the number killed by the Spanish. Before The Jungle was published in 1906, meat-related deaths seemed to be an inescapable fact of life.
According to the Centers for Disease Control, there are 76 million cases of food poisoning in the United States every year, 332,000 hospitalizations, and 5,000 deaths.
Most of these deaths are caused by a bacteria called E. coli 0157H7. It comes from cattle feces. Cattle carry it into the slaughterhouses. There, it gets into the meat.
Food safety is a shared responsibility. It's got to start with the people who are growing the crops or raising the animals. The people who sell the product through a restaurant or through a grocery store have a responsibility to keep their facilities clean. And then the final food preparer has a responsibility to make sure that they cook foods properly.
Forcing the meat industry to do it right was Upton Sinclair's mission nearly a century ago. He'd achieve it by disguising himself as a worker and infiltrating Chicago's packing houses. It was a risky business, but the circumstances of his own life called for desperate measures.
He had been there, he had felt the cold, he had not been able to buy food, he had had a leaky roof, so he put that into The Jungle, that's for sure.
Writing The Jungle was not Sinclair's idea. He'd published an article in the socialist newspaper, Appeal to Reason, about a workers' strike in Chicago. The newspaper asked him to go back and research a book about wage slavery in the meat industry. In disguise as a working man, Sinclair encountered the real-life characters he'd portray in The Jungle.
He was fascinated with the people who were there, with how they looked, with the music, and he made it the material of The Jungle. Smart choice.
Now, a year has passed in the lives of Sinclair's newlyweds. Ona and Jorgis have an infant son, but shortly after his birth, the disasters pile on. Jorgis's father, Antonis, sickens from working in a cold, wet factory. He dies. Jorgis barely has time to mourn before he slips on a blood-slicked floor in the killing room. Homebound with a sprained ankle, he loses his job. Now he was second-hand, he realizes. A damaged article. They did not want him. As Jorgis's strength ebbs, so does Ona's innocence.
And when they came to work the next
She confesses to Marija that she's submitted to her boss, a man called Connor. Ona becomes pregnant and can't hide the truth from Jorgis. Mad with rage, the laborer attacks Ona's boss and is thrown in jail. Out of work, behind bars, Jorgis surrenders to despair. Chicago has defeated them. He can't imagine the worst is still to come. Once out of jail, Sinclair's hero, Jorgis Rutgers, plunges into new disasters. His worst fear comes true. The bank has taken the house. Then he finds Ona and Marija in a filthy boarding house. Ona suffers a torturous labor. The infant is stillborn. The ordeal kills Ona. Soon after, the last straw, Jorgis's young son falls through a rotten sidewalk and drowns in the filth beneath. In despair, the laborer simply abandons Chicago and the shattered remnants of his family.
What Sinclair has really done is to sort of roll up a lot of different tragedies into the life of one family. That's probably unrealistic for that amount of tragedy to occur within one family. For these types of situations to develop in a community like Packingtown in one or another family was actually quite common.
It created this traditional, naturalistic, deterministic story in which human beings, just like the animals that are pulled up the chute in the packing plants, and they are pulled up with this sense of optimism at the beginning, this idea of going to America, becoming successful, leaving behind the problems of Europe, and then they go down just like the animals, and they are processed too.
With the publication of The Jungle in 1906, Upton Sinclair's own problems were suddenly miraculously over. Its publisher advertised it as an expose about health violations, not the plight of the poor, as Sinclair intended. Public outcry caused by The Jungle compelled Congress to pass the 1906 Meat Inspection Act. But for Sinclair, it wasn't enough. He declared a one-man war against meat and peppered American newspapers with scathing editorials demanding reform. The president himself, Teddy Roosevelt, tried to soothe the agitator. "Mr. Sinclair, keep your head," he wrote the author. To his publisher, "Tell Sinclair to go home and let me run the country for a while."
Mary had a little lamb, and when she saw it sicken, she shipped it off to Packingtown. And now it's labeled chicken. New York Evening Post.
Federal laws passed in the wake of The Jungle barred packers from adding fillers and impurities to meat. They put USDA inspectors in every meat plant in America. If they didn't like how meat looks, smells, or feels, they withheld the USDA's blue seal of approval. Haunted by tragedy, Jurgis, the hero of The Jungle, has fled Chicago. Far from the torment of Packingtown, he works on farms and lives among migrant, rootless men. In the country, Jurgis regains his strength, but his spirit remains deeply wounded. The end of the harvest season drives Sinclair's hero back to Chicago, where he finds and loses a succession of jobs. But no matter what he does, he's still underpaid, unprotected from injury, virtually a slave. Jurgis's pain is a theme Sinclair hoped would stir America's heart. To the author, a lifelong vegetarian, the meat issues didn't matter much. What did matter was that men and women were suffering, children were starving. It was an American disgrace.
There can be no soul life for any man so long as men, women, and little children are chained up to toil and perish in misery.
Once more in Chicago, Jurgis discovers that Marisha, Ona's cousin, has embarked on a shocking new life.
Marisha. When people are starving, and someone has something worth a price, they should sell it, I say.
Prostitution was very common in a city like Chicago, and a lot of the people that turned to that as a way to get by were poor women like Marija that were not able to make it as wage earners. Sinclair tries to show the corruption of individuals in the novel, good people, people who started out early in the story as very positive characters, and I think Marija probably represents that about as well as any character in the novel.
Seeking shelter from the cold, the penniless Jurgis plunges into a meeting hall. The speaker tells a tale of suffering, much like Jurgis's own.
Or will you, with the rage and fury of the wrongs committed against you, find your voice? Will you say no? And will your comrade beside you also say no? And the voice of labor, the voice of a mighty stirring giant, will crush the system with one word. No! No! Ladies and gentlemen, this is the voice of the oppressed pronouncing the doom of oppression!
The Order is a socialist organizer. In subsequent days, Jorgis falls in with a crowd of socialist leaders. They find him a new job, and soon he dares to hope about the future.
A lot of the problems that we're looking at in the jungle are addressed over a period of time, but they're not solved by brilliant young socialist writers like Upton Sinclair. The solutions emerged from Packingtown itself through unionization, through community organizing, and actually through supporting one another on a day-to-day kind of a basis.
He didn't know how socialism was going to work, but in the last words of that novel, he knew Chicago will be ours, and socialism somehow would triumph.
But it didn't. The laborers of Packingtown would struggle for decades to win fair wages and decent lives for their families. And Sinclair would stubbornly cling to socialist ideals that would never prevail.
And stride forth a free man at last.
H.L. Mencken wrote, "Dear Sinclair, I find your note on my return from Europe. As always, you are right, save in matters of politics, sociology, religion, literature, economics, and the exact sciences." Prominent thinkers such as Mencken and celebrities like Charlie Chaplin now populated Sinclair's universe. He'd remain in the public eye for the rest of his life, and even run for governor of California.
We are going forward to show the way and to bring back prosperity and safety to our whole country.
Before his death at 90, Sinclair would publish nearly 100 titles, but his later work would never equal the book that made him famous.
What The Jungle did is it raised enough awareness that a national inspection system resulted.
It was a microcosm, a look at the 20th century as it was unfolding and all the different battle lines between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. And in that sense, it's an enduring classic.
The Jungle held up a mirror to the young century. It rescued Sinclair from his painful youth, and it helped America face its own growing pains.
Keep watching. Discussion topics and activity and resources for great books, The Jungle, are up next on Assignment Discovery. Now that you've seen great books, The Jungle, talk about this. The program suggests that factory workers in Chicago's meatpacking plants were processed just like the animals they slaughtered. Discuss the degree to which this analogy is accurate. How were the immigrant workers mistreated? Now try this. Create a double-sided brochure advertising America to immigrants in the early part of the 20th century. On one side, describe positive aspects and opportunities, and on the other, list harsh realities. Log on to discoveryschool.com for curriculum materials and resources to support great books, The Jungle. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests The 1900s, edited by Myra H. Immel.